Tastemakers was funded in part by...
What does a craftsperson look like? Is it this? Or this? Or is it this? Is it possible a craftsperson might also look like this? Edward Jones salutes the makers who share their expertise and take pride in their craft.
The rise in craft brewing and artisan baking has led to a resurgence in local mills and heritage grains. In this episode of Tastemakers, come along with me to Austin, Texas, and meet a classical musician turned miller who is supplying the area's best brewers, bakers, and distillers with freshly milled local grains. I'm Kat Neville, and I've been telling the story of local food for about 20 years. In that time, I've seen the American food movement explode in tiny towns and big cities from coast to coast. In Tastemakers, I explore the maker movement and take you along for the journey to meet the makers who define the flavor of American cuisine. Just about every culture on Earth has grain as part of its diet, and we've been cultivating grain for about 10,000 years. Over the last century, however, as food became industrialized, the network of mills that used to crisscross the country has broken down. That is changing, and here in Central Texas, Barton Springs Mill is leading the shift to local grains.
I tried several times to get out of the music business, unsuccessfully. In one of those attempts, I was a chef for a while. And as I was getting ready to think about what I wanted to do in retirement, which for me is going to mean simply a different job than my primary job, I wanted to find some other way that I could make an impact in the culinary field. And I'd gotten big into baking at home and started reading about locally and regionally sourced grains and flours. So I wanted to find that here in Texas, and after doing some research, found that there really was no source for that. And I found what I wanted to do for my second job. If you look at the model for our namesake, Barton Springs Mill, everything was grown and consumed locally and regionally. And that would apply to wheat and rye and corn. In the late 1800s, you get the invention of the roller mill. And around the time of World War I, we started seeing more and more of this rush to find easier, quicker, more efficient ways, not only to raise the grain crops, but to process, clean, and mill them, and to make bread faster for a much larger populace. And this is where things really started to go wrong.
Barton Springs Mill is what is known as a grain hub. James brings in grain from a range of local farmers and then mills and distributes to local bakers, brewers, and distillers. It's this type of regional connectedness that we lost with the industrialization of food.
The grain industry was one of the things that was really destroyed with the centralization of bread and flour production, and also monocropping in these large-scale farms that make wheat and rye and corn. There's a lot more tied to it too in terms of health and digestibility in grains. People are wanting to return to many of the older varieties, not only because they have great flavor, but because of nutritive value and also the fact that they know how their body will behave in terms of consuming these grains. Many people are suffering from inflammatory responses from conventionally raised grain, so knowing where their grain comes from and how it's been treated from the time it was planted until the time it goes into flour in a bag is super important. We do have these modern varieties of wheat that are bred for disease resistance, pest resistance, high yield, drought resistance, with flavor, baking performance, nutrition being further down the line in terms of priority. And when we return to these ancient varieties, there's more flavor. Potentially there's better nutrition, particularly in whole grains. We're working with farmers who are farming organically, so there's no pesticides, herbicides, or any other chemicals used during the process of raising these grains. A Once they go from there, they come straight here to our mill. So they pass any grain elevators where store sides may be sprayed on them. Usually also in the milling process, they will blend multiple types of wheat together and also add dough enhancers. It'll be fortified with chemical vitamins, could possibly be bromated. And even when they make whole wheat, a lot of it ultimately is not 100% whole grain. It's just the bran and endosperm leaving the germ out. So there's quite a bit to it that's different, and the route is far more circuitous than it is here, which is straight from the farm to our door.
James partners with a number of farmers to supply grain for his mill, and I'm actually standing in a field of wheat that had been harvested about a couple of weeks ago. We're going to go meet the farmer who grew this grain right now. I'm standing here with Cameron, and he's a fourth-generation farmer, and we're here actually in front of the combines that you and your dad use here on the farm. Kind of tell me about the crops that you're growing.
We grow milo, corn, wheat, oats, and then we do a lot of custom hay work and everything. That's been our main generation of income, that, and then with my father doing molasses, liquid feed for cattle ranches. And then James has kind of been working with us and helping us. And he comes out and visits all the cropland and everything, and we're trying to all work together.
So what variety of wheat are you growing?
This year we have a Rouge for him and then a Red Fife. For him, milling it, different varieties do different types of milling and different tastes and everything else.
Is it like a real sense of accomplishment when you see that field just full of wheat that's ready?
It is. When the wheat is nice and tall and golden and the wind kind of comes over it and kind of just looks like a nice ocean going across, it's one of the prettiest sights out there.
So can we go take a look at the grain?
We can.
All right. So Cameron grows two different kinds of wheat, and they really look different, and you said they even smell different.
Red Fife, it just smells like a little bit of fresh flour. The Rouge actually smells like a little sweeter, especially if it's sitting in the bag. It kind of smells like a kind of a sweeter smelling. He has one variety up there, you can take it out and you'll smell it. It smells almost like sugar.
Really?
It's crazy how just a natural product like this can take on an old natural sweet taste.
The new varieties of wheat, they grow faster, they produce more, but they don't really have the flavor.
They don't. It's just kind of a filler versus these old varieties, depending on the soil types and what you kind of do to them for the natural fertilizers. For us, we do molasses. We sell molasses for cattle, so it's just a straight sugar cane is all it is, cooked down and made into molasses for cattle. For a mineral supplement is what it is. And so that's what we put on the field. We just mix molasses with water and then we spray that out onto the field or dribble it on the field.
And that's what you use for your fertilizer?
Yeah.
That's cool.
James says I guess maybe it adds to it and makes it a little sweeter. I know it helps the soil a little more because the molasses has a lot more nutrients in it.
When was this harvested?
This was harvested about 2 weeks ago, and we just been kind of drying it down a little bit.
And so once it's dry enough,
then
you
take it
on to James.
Yep, and then that's when he can mill it. If he gets it too wet, then it's gonna gum up the mill and it won't crack right and it won't produce flour right. Versus if you get it too dry, then it cracks too much and it won't produce a good flour. So it's kind of right at that sweet spot that you gotta get it to him.
Awesome. Well, we're gonna follow this wheat to the mill and watch the seed cleaner in action. After the wheat is harvested and threshed, just like we saw back at Cameron's farm, it is trucked here to Barton Springs Mill, and it's run through the seed cleaner. The seed cleaner was actually built back in the 1930s. You may be wondering what grain actually is. It is simply the seed of a grass like wheat, rye, or spelt. And whole grain is that seed, that whole berry left fully intact. So whole grain flour is just that fully intact seed, simply milled.
So there are three major parts to a wheat berry or a rye berry. You have the bran on the exterior, that's the hard outer shell. You have the endosperm, which is the white starchy substance. That is the source of energy for the seed to actually begin growing. And then you have the germ, that is the egg. So that's the whole grain, the complete grain. Many times in roller milling, what will happen is as they mill and separate those three items, they'll reincorporate the endosperm, the white starchy part that we think of as flour, with the bran and not allow the germ to be reintroduced because it's not shelf stable. You have germ oil that has a tendency to go rancid, and with flour sitting on supermarket shelves for months and months, they can't guarantee that that will be fresh. So in many instances, these whole wheat flours that you find in the supermarket may not indeed be 100% whole grain. Here, we're simply putting berries into the mill and crushing them and putting it into a bag. So everything's there. The germ oil is essentially expressed and distributed into the endosperm, so you have all of the nutritive value and all of the flavor that comes from that. The stone milling makes a better quality flour, in my opinion. What we're looking at is a distribution of particle size. There are many that believe that the finer the bran particles in particular, the easier it is to make a loftier, lighter loaf of bread. And so we make very fine flour. Hammer milling is a great way to make big things into little things in a hurry. To give you a comparison, we make about 165 pounds of flour an hour off of the big stone mill that we have. We can make about 3,000 pounds an hour on the hammer mill. And for the purposes of brewing and distilling, that's just fine. What they want is access to those starches to get that fermentation going. They're not quite as concerned about this equal distribution of particle size.
So this is a stone mill, which means that there are these two massive stones that rotate in opposite directions and they crush the grains. And this is the only processing that happens to the wheat. You're not adding anything to it, you're just running it through the mill, crushing the grain, and sifting it, and then putting it into a package.
If you buy whole wheat from us, it's straight from the mill into a bag. If it's a sifted product where we've removed some portion of the bran, it goes to the sifter and then into the bag, that's it.
And so why are some sifted and some not? What's the purpose for the end user?
A sifted flour, particularly a heavily sifted flour, will make a whiter, lighter loaf of bread. Not everyone wants a dark, robust flavor in every baking application. We also have a lot of people who make pizza and pasta and they want something that has less bran, or preferably next to no bran in it. It's impossible to make a 100% bran-free product in this method, but that's the beauty of it as far as I'm concerned.
So what do you do with the extra bran?
Right now, some of it goes out to our professional bakers who will make bran muffins and other bran products out of it. A lot of it goes to a local organic mushroom farmer who sterilizes it and uses it as a bedding medium for some varieties of Japanese mushrooms.
Perfect. I love that. I mean, all of it's being used. Even if it's not being used directly to bake bread, it still is being used in food production.
Nothing goes to waste.
Modern grain varieties have been bred for drought resistance and high yield, but the heritage grains that James mills at Barton Springs are focused on flavor. That's exactly why the folks here at Sourdough use almost everything that James produces. So let's head inside and check it out.
As a baker, you make your decisions on flour based on performance and flavor. So each of the different types of flour that James carries have a little bit of different baking qualities. All of the sourdough bread that we do here is produced with 100% of the pre-fermented flour. So actually the sourdough flour, it comes from Barton Springs Mill. The brownie that we make here at Sourdough features the Abruzzi rye flour, as well as a little bit of Rouge de Bordeaux. We were looking to produce a brownie that had flavors that complemented deep chocolate and cocoa powder, and also highlighted some of the olive oil. The fruit kolache that we make here features a little bit of sourdough starter in it, and then we have the Rouge de Bordeaux flour for its spice notes. The pastry cream that we use on top of that fruit kolache is going to feature some of the mesquite powder that's hammer milled out at Barton Springs Mill, along with whatever Texas fruit is seasonal and available. The chocolate chip cookie that we make here at the bakery features the Sonora 65% sifted flour. It's a little bit more whole wheat flour, so while it's not the #1 concern when you're eating a chocolate chip cookie, it is a little bit healthier than your average chocolate chip cookie.
Here at Easy Tiger, head dough puncher David Norman was one of the first folks to use Barton Springs Mill flour in his breads. And David is going to show us how to make a really dense Danish rye bread. So you start off with the rye flour from Barton Springs, is that right?
Yes, we have the rye flour in here, ground on the stone mill, but I also buy the rye berries, and then we cook them, because if you just put them in the bread, they'd be hard, crack your teeth. So you cook those first, and then this is our rye sour. So this is a sourdough culture that was started and fed only with rye flour.
So what does rye taste like?
To me, it tastes like the earth. It's
Okay.
very earthy, more so than wheat.
How about this oat bread? Let's talk about this,
Yeah,
because
the
this
oat
is
bread.
your own invention, right?
It is. I developed it as a toasting bread.
And so the Barton Springs whole wheat is the base of this, but then you incorporate like actual oatmeal into
Right,
it.
we cook the oats into an oatmeal and then add that in at the end of the mix.
Oh, wow.
You can see little flecks of them, but they've kind of melded into the dough.
That smells wonderful.
So this bread is our pain au levain. It's a French-style sourdough, and it has a little bit of whole rye in it, only about 3%. But then I add about 20% whole spelt into this too.
That's gorgeous.
This is our multigrain. That has whole wheat, whole spelt, and whole rye in it, and then a 9-grain cereal in it as well.
Beautiful.
And then this is our German-style rye bread. This is just 40% rye, but it has that same rye sour, and because it's a dark whole rye, it still has that beautiful color to it.
And that's what's wonderful. I mean, you have spelt, rye, whole wheat, all these different grains that are grown right here in Texas can make completely different types of breads with different flavor profiles.
Yeah, it's fun to play with.
Jester King is famous for its spontaneously fermented beers and its use of local ingredients, and that philosophy extends into the kitchen, where it exclusively uses Barton Springs Mill flour.
Our inspiration stems from historical farmhouse breweries that once dotted the landscape of much of Western Europe, and by using all of the agricultural inputs around them, they would make beer that was unique to place and time and people, so we really strive to emulate the same thing here. Over the last few years, we've started to develop more things here at Jester King, and part of that has been starting a kitchen. We have a pizzeria, and we also do wood-fired dishes. We've started a small farm to try to support both the kitchen and the brewery. We grow grapes, perennial plants, annual plants, hops, and then we have a goat farm as well. Our hope is to ultimately make cheese out here, and then also the goats do rotational grazing, and they're a great source of fertilization for our land. As far as Barton Springs Mill, they use their grain for all of our dough for both our pizza and our bread. By us supporting James, we're in turn supporting Texas agriculture, and then, true to our philosophy, making something that is unique to place.
Barton Springs Mill supplies Treaty Oak Distilling with about 1.7 million pounds of grain every year. The partnership has grown to the point where James is actually building a new expanded facility here on site. So I'm standing inside of the distillery here at Treaty Oak with Daniel. So explain to me the evolution of Treaty Oak, because you have a restaurant, you have a cocktail lab, there's so much going on here.
We're all about the innovative pursuit of the curious. And so to us, there's a lot of science, art, history, innovation that can all be found within what we do in food and beverage.
Yeah.
And really leaning into that, appreciating the pursuit of knowledge, getting to experiment together, getting to understand kind of how we make things. So when you walk onto Treaty Oak, it's 28 acres. This was a working cattle ranch when we bought it.
Okay.
And so all the buildings you see, we've actually done ourselves. You have Alice's Restaurant, which is named after my mom, since my parents owned a restaurant growing up. Our visitor center and cocktail lab. And then the distillery itself that we're in here is about 6,000 square feet. And then we have our first rick house, which we just filled up on barrels, about 3,000 barrels. And we're starting construction on our next rick house in 2 weeks now.
It's amazing.
It's been fun, for sure.
It's really testament to the quality of the spirits that you're producing. How did all of this evolve to where you essentially have your miller on site?
So James and I met back in 2017. I saw a small blurb about what he was doing and just getting started up. That was in one of the local magazines. Reached out to James, he came, and we started talking about different corns and grains and have been working together ever since.
Daniel and I are very like-minded about wanting to be in close proximity to each other. It's well over 1 million pounds of grain a year that we need to source and mill for them in order to meet their production needs. So he was nice enough to make it very attractive to us to buy 2.5 acres from him to build our new headquarters.
You truly have a partnership with James, because you're not just calling up a faceless person and ordering something from a warehouse. You can talk to him about the character of these products.
Absolutely.
And really be able to have that conversation that means that when you create these products, they are completely unique to you, they're completely unique to Texas and this place. They have a sense of real terroir, which is what I think a lot of consumers are looking for.
The launch of Barton Springs Mill, in my opinion, has been the single most significant thing happening to the Austin food scene in the last 10 years. In terms of other businesses that are opening, other restaurants that are opening, or food trends, it seemed like the thing that impacted or pushed the food scene in Austin the furthest down the road of progression.
We're lucky to have James in the area and to be able to buy flour from him and also support another local business. And we have this incredible opportunity to try different grains through James, and that's what we're looking for, is different flavors. Yes, the art of baking is fermenting those grains and adding flavor to them, but when you start with full flavor, you end up with so much more.
It's incredibly important to us as a company, as a cooperative, to be respectful in our sourcing. So with James, we have access to local, small-scale farmers who understand the value of the water and the soil, and that flavor and really the essence of that respect translates into our spirits.
I'm very pleased that we've traveled in a direction as a culture where uniqueness, individuality in terms of flavor creation, as well as just some of the more kind of socioeconomic aspects have become more important, like where we're sourcing our food, what is the nutritional value of our food, are we stripping away all the nutrients and just having essentially, nothing that's all that nourishing left over. And people have become, I think, more aware generally that there is a difference.
When you buy a loaf of bread that's made in the way that we think bread should be made, in other words, long fermented, by a skilled artisan, from wheat that was grown organically by a farmer who was paid a fair wage, milled by a miller who took the time to care for the grain and to process it in the right way and package it on demand so that it could be used as freshly as possible. Those are the value adds that you get from this system.
From Cameron's Field to the bourbon right here in my glass, we've seen how one mill and its innovative miller have become a hub for local grains. For more information on Barton Springs Mill, as well as all of the other incredible makers featured in this series, just head to wearetastemakers.com. Thank you so much for joining me here in Central Texas, and I'll see you next time. Connect with us online at wearetastemakers.com or through social media on these handles.
Tastemakers was funded in part by...
What does a craftsperson look like? Is it this? Or this? Or is it this? Is it possible a craftsperson might also look like this? Edward Jones salutes the makers who share their expertise and take pride in their craft.